Welcome to Teach, Learn, Share, a podcast that thoughtfully explores teaching and learning practices in higher ed. I'm Margot Eckenberg.
And I'm Jasmine Pavin. This podcast is brought to you by Teaching and Learning Services at McGill University. We're recording today from Montreal, Quebec, on unceded land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We honor their stewardship as we live and work on these lands.
Low class attendance rates and a sense of students' lack of engagement are issues instructors have struggled with for decades. Why don't students come to class? Why are they so quiet? Why don't they participate? Today, though, given the effects of moving online during the COVID-19 pandemic and the sense that learning happens beyond the classroom as well as in the classroom, student attitudes towards learning and attending class seem to have shifted in ways that go well beyond what was considered normal before. When students do come to class, demands on their attention don't stop, even when they make an effort to turn all the notifications of their phone off. Jasmine and I are back to find out more about current ideas around engagement and learning on campus today. Have student perceptions on engagement changed after the COVID-19 pandemic? Is it harder to focus on lectures given the attention economy where companies vie for clicks and our data and our time? We also want to know if students are engaging with learning in ways that are more autonomous. So students often talk about enjoying watching recorded lectures or benefiting from them in terms of the learning that's happening to be able to go back to a recorded lecture. So this is something also that's changed the dynamic in terms of engagement and learning. We also are curious to know if instructors and students share the same ideas about what it means to be engaged. So we'll be asking a lot of these questions over the course of several different episodes. In terms of pedagogy, I just wanted to speak really briefly to some of the things that we know. So we know in terms of cognitive engagement that there is a direct correlation between how engaged the student is and how they're going to learn or what their learning outcomes are going to be. And we can talk, as often happens in the scholarship of teaching and learning, about different levels of cognitive engagement that go from everything of being passive. A passive level of cognitive engagement would be sitting in a lecture and listening exclusively, through other levels that are active, constructive, or even interactive, where the student learner is actually engaging with the material in such a way, interacting with what they're doing, even constructing their learning themselves. We know that those require different efforts, and we also know that depending on the degree of cognitive engagement with the task, students do certainly retain more. So the chance of long-term retention of what they've learned goes up based on how high the level of cognitive engagement is. But does all of this theory match up with student experiences? We're not sure. So today we're going to speak to two current undergraduates at McGill to find out.
This topic is one that I am very interested in learning more about, and I'm really excited to hear directly from students. I think that there are a few shifts at play here. One element of learning during the pandemic was this sudden transition to online learning, where students had to become more responsible for managing their own time and learning, leading to a more autonomous style of engagement. And while some students did thrive in this kind of self-paced environment, others struggled with motivation and the lack of face-to-face interaction. And I can only imagine that first-year students might have particularly struggled with this because they're not really given a chance to learn how to be self-led or self-motivated. Being autonomous or being an autonomous learner requires skills, including time management, that need to be developed for most people. And I wonder if for many of the younger students, this dramatic shift that happened during that time to remote learning online modeled a type of, and I quote, norm for higher ed that wasn't previously there. So when we transitioned back into the classroom, many students were kind of starting over in terms of learning what it means or what it meant to be a university student and what it means to be engaged in class, and maybe starting over in terms of understanding how they might learn best. I also think that in this episode, we're acknowledging that engagement is very personal and can vary from student to student, and achieving those levels of cognitive engagement that Margot talked about may look different for different people, and yet those people will arrive at a very similar outcome. We also can't forget that along with cognitive engagement, there's emotional and social engagement too, and this will also impact learning. So some students might feel most engaged when they connect what they're learning to their interests or future goals, while others need a sense of belonging in the classroom. So I feel like we're at a bit of a head here with a few things going on generally in the world or in higher ed that may be impacting engagement. So we're learning more about how people learn and how people feel engaged in general. We're also navigating this post-pandemic context, which is unique and unprecedented in itself. And as you said, Margot, we're also navigating a very rapid evolution of technology and how it can be a constant distraction. We do pretty much everything online now. We shop, we chat, we browse, we pay bills, et cetera, et cetera. And so this ability to do so and at any time can make it difficult to focus. I know that's definitely a distraction for me. So I can only imagine how students might feel.
Absolutely. And I think we could probably do a whole other episode on the notion of engagement and what it means also to, or even just what it means to be paying attention. And I think even the very idea of what it means to pay attention has changed. And if you ask different people, right, are you paying attention? And they might say yes, but there's a big generational gap there too, right? A big generational divide where sometimes people will say, you're not listening to me. And they're like, yeah, I am, even though they're looking at their phone, for example. So really happy to be back chatting today. And why don't we meet our guests?
Today, we've invited two undergraduate students to the podcast, Kai and Lavínia. I was wondering if you both could tell us a little bit about yourselves, where you're from, what you're studying, maybe what year you're in, and you can share something fun if you'd like.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Kai, and I'm from Toronto, and I'm in my very last semester of my undergrad degree at McGill. I'm majoring in linguistics, and I have a double minor in English literature and in French. And something fun about me is that I speak German and French because I am in linguistics, and we love learning languages.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. So my name is Lavínia. I'm in my third year of my Bachelor of Education with concentration in history and geography. Something fun about me, that's a hard one, incredibly unfun. I will just follow Kai's lead and go with the language thing. So I speak Portuguese and Spanish as well, which is great, especially in a multicultural place like McGill.
Thanks for sharing. I can't say that linguistics is one of my strong suits. So very, very cool that you both speak 3 or more languages. So thanks so much to both of you for being here with us today. We're very thrilled to have you on the Teach, Learn, Share podcast, and we're excited to hear your perspectives. I said before in my intro that engagement can be something that is very personal and it can differ from person to person. So I thought we would kick off the episode with having you both talk about what engagement means to you and why you feel it's important to be engaged as a student.
Yeah, so when I was thinking about what engagement means to me, all I could really think is that in my mind, it's so close to being synonymous with learning. And that the way I see it is it's more of a feeling, I guess, that I have in my brain when I am engaged. And I think maybe we all know this feeling and it all feels different for us. But for me, that's the feeling of learning, and it's a feeling I really enjoy. And even engagement in different contexts, like outside of the classroom, I still think of it in the same way. You're like gaining new information and processing it and responding to it within yourself. And for me, that's how I think of engagement. So I really do think of it as learning, or as being the biggest part of learning.
I really love that. I appreciate that. And this has come up, I think, in an episode before where we talk about how learning is fun and most people like to learn. So yeah, being engaged does in fact equal learning. So I think that's great that you made that direct connection. What about you, Lavínia?
Yes, in a similar fashion, I related that to the idea of learning. But I think more than just learning itself is a sense that what you're learning matters to you and to your future endeavors, but in the way that it matters now. So I was trying to think of a metaphor that I could bring, and I was thinking about an orchestra. And if you have everyone play in sync and they're all in tune, I think that's engagement. It's when you are able to participate in whichever activity you chose to, in a way that it matters, in a way that you're creating something more than your original product, if that makes sense. So I think ultimately it's a sense of relevance. It's whatever you're doing here and now matters and will continue to matter.
I appreciate that you both talked about sort of this sense of what it might feel like, or this recognition that something's positive is happening, whether it's very internal and personal on an individual level, or to build on the orchestra metaphor, right? This idea of learning in conjunction with others, being in a space of learning and feeling engaged with others around what learning means to you, but also a shared space of learning, I think is also a really, really interesting idea. But I love the fact that it's very tied to kind of an internal reflection, even internal emotions that we don't always put into words. So I appreciate you doing it. Let's talk a little bit about how and why you think engagement might have changed for you during the pandemic, or you could speak to either before, during, or after the pandemic in terms of any kind of change that you might have felt for yourself.
So I think for me personally, the challenge was to establish a line between in-person engagement, the sense of being in the room where it happens, if you will, and then engaging remotely. And I guess the point was to find a sense of relevance within all of that repetition, of having classes remotely, meetings remotely, and usually I was in the same room. It got a bit overwhelming at points, but at the same time, because I tend to thrive on the sense of discipline and almost routine, for me, at some point, it became the normal. And I think that also became a problem later on, transitioning back into normal life, because I was so used to that sense of repetition. It became a challenge for me sometimes to accept change and thrive on that as well.
Thank you. How about you, Kai? What would you say was a change, if there was one, in terms of your engagement pre and post pandemic?
I think there were definitely a lot of changes. When I started at McGill, it was fully online. So that just was definitely a strange experience. It made me feel like, I'm not really sure what it means to actually be a university student and be in one of those giant classrooms that I've seen in TV shows. It was a completely different experience and not at all what I expected. So transitioning from like a year and a half of that back into in-person was a really big shift. And I think in terms of engagement, I've always had 8:30 a.m. classes since I started at McGill. I've had at least one every single semester. And I think when I was learning online and I was able to sleep in until the last possible minute and just roll out of bed and open up my laptop, and there was so little effort required for me to get to class, it was such a shocker to then switch over to having to wake up like at least an hour and a half before and do all this prep and then get on the subway and get to class. And I think that amount of effort that I put in just to get into class really sort of forced me to be engaged, because I was showing myself like, I want to be here. Look at all this stuff I did just to get here on time for my 8:30 class. Like, I had to wake up so much earlier than I normally would. So that made me feel like it was easier to be engaged. And I also think I really came to appreciate what it takes for teachers and instructors to get a whole classroom of people to be engaged, because it is a lot of work, especially in bigger classes and especially online. That must have been very hard. So I have really come to appreciate that as well.
You bring up a really interesting point there, Kai, about the effort it takes to get ready to go to class, which makes me think of motivation. So we often think of engagement and motivation as being related. Sometimes people use it synonymously, but it isn't necessarily. So with that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about motivation and what you feel the relationship is between engagement and motivation. So the effort it's taking to come to class is making you motivated to want to be engaged. But yeah, could you distinguish between the two and how you feel motivation and engagement are related?
Yeah, I definitely feel like motivation leads to engagement, but also that engagement requires active motivation. In my brain, they are very much overlapping, because I think when you're talking about engagement or motivation, in both cases, you need to want it. You need to have a desire to go to class or a desire to learn. And perhaps those are both more so motivation. But without those, you're not going to be able to be engaged. And once you do feel yourself engaging, that releases a sort of dopamine, or at least I feel it does. And it's like a reward for your motivation. So that's the way I sort of see the relationship between the two. I think most people enjoy learning, but for me, I really love learning and I love the feeling of it. So it's very rewarding to get into that state of engagement and to feel like I'm actively learning so many different things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Lavínia, you talked a little bit about being engaged in a different way and finding that motivation in being more autonomous during the pandemic. So I'm wondering what your take is on this, because I feel like it might be a little bit different.
Yeah, I think for me personally, and I do know that some people will agree with me here, my motivation comes from the sense of purpose, in the sense of why am I doing this? Why does it matter? And because I'm in education, my sense of purpose has often been to be in the classroom with kids and to share knowledge. So my sense of motivation is basically my end game, my why am I doing this and why will it matter? And by having that very clear definition of what was important to me, of what kind of knowledge I wanted to get in order to be able to share it at some point, that's what kept me motivated during the pandemic, and that's what still keeps me motivated. Whereas engagement, for me, I think it's the here and now. It's basically, if I want to say that motivation is the end game or my final destination, my engagement is what will get me there. So it's what I do. It's the baby steps, the things that you do day after day after day. So it's all that effort, as Kai mentioned, all the effort it takes to get to class. And when you are in class and all the work that comes with it, do your readings, write your notes, write your midterms, what have you. It's the everyday effort that most of us take for granted because we have it as our normal life. But to go back to our previous question during the pandemic, when that was taken from us, then, where did that engagement come from? We had to find other ways to be engaged. And many of us, myself included, failed miserably at that. So at times I found myself not engaged at all. And I had this horrible feeling that I wasn't learning anything, And then on other days, I felt like I was learning better because it could go at my own pace, because it could do my readings at my own time, because it could, for some of my classes that were recorded, go back and watch them again. I think what really comes down to, in terms of a difference, that there is a symbiotic relationship, in the sense that one feeds on the other one. But at the same time, I think that being engaged and motivated are different. And I think that's why we struggled so much during the pandemic, because we had to find that distinction.
I really appreciate how you framed that, Lavínia. So framing the motivation as your why. Why am I doing this? Why do I want to learn this? And then the engagement as the how you're going to be involving yourself in the learning process. So I think that that's a really interesting way to break it down and distinguish between the two. I also want to say that I love both of you keep coming back to your own definitions of engagement. Kai, yours being joy, and Lavínia, yours being meaning, like connecting meaning to what you're learning, and that being very important. And I just want to say that that really does model what we said at the beginning, how personal and how deep engagement and learning can be. So thank you for returning to those two definitions.
I want to also just build on the how for a moment. I think we're talking about engagement as engaging and interesting as it is. We're doing it in a rather abstract way. So I wanted to ask you both to give, if you could, a concrete example of when you really feel engaged. And it can be either something that's happening in class, an in-class activity that you've experienced that made you feel like this is really what I want to be doing. I'm 100% in. Or it can also be a task that you did outside of the class as part of an assessment, but that you were really, you found that your engagement level went up.
For me, when I picture engagement, I picture myself like physically interacting with the content in some way. So like a lecture would be not a super engaging thing. That's why I think we talk about how can we make lectures more engaging, because you're just sitting there and the information is being shown to you or being said to you. But engagement, you're dealing with the material in some way where you're being active, and so it's actively going into your brain. So if I think of an example, definitely in classes when you have to interact with other students and you are discussing the material in some way. Like I think in a lot of my literature classes, it can often be very wordy and just lectures, and sometimes they don't even have any visual aids at all. But earlier this semester in a literature class, we were told to turn to the person beside us and to read through this poem that we were reading, and to basically do a close reading together and come up with different ideas about it. And I felt like that was a good example of the teacher turning things around and making things super engaging for us, which really stood out in a literature class context, because those are ones that I do struggle to engage with. So I think that is definitely one clear way of feeling engaged, is when you have to talk to a complete stranger about the content. You really have to be tapped in or locked in. And that's how I think of engagement for sure.
Great. How about you, Lavínia? Can you give us an example?
Well, it's very interesting how Kai is emphasizing the physical element, the being there and engaging physically with people. Whereas for me, engagement is much more about intellectual agency and actually owning that knowledge or the material that you are studying. So maybe it's because my focus has always been in education. So I'm always, as I'm sitting, for example, in a Canadian history class, I'm thinking, how can I make this relevant to my future grade 7 students or to my future grade 11 students? So I'm always trying to know as much as possible, but actually knowing, understanding it in a way that I can later on translate and adapt that material into something that will be more relevant to my future students. So I guess for me, it's much more about learning something and understanding it to such an extent that I'm able to reframe it, that I'm able to almost dissect it later on and create my own Frankenstein, and make it as clear and as palatable as I can to other students. So I guess whereas Kai is talking about more physical engagement, which I think it's pivotal and important, and I honestly think that it's what I lack sometimes. For me, it's much more on the intellectual side, on the how can I make this as relevant as possible? How can I put action into it? It's much more about having agency over the material as opposed to physically being surrounded by other people.
It's still really, really interesting, though, because it speaks to how you learn. And I think, we began the episode by thinking about the connection between engagement and learning. And I think because there's different kinds of learners, it also makes sense that there be different kinds of engagement. Both of your examples speak to your own sense, too, of what it means to learn. So I wanted to ask something about potential distractions or feeling like you might be motivated and you might also have the best intentions of wanting to engage with learning, engage with the in-class activity, a lecture, or working on a assessment task outside of the classroom. But there are many, many demands on our time now, and it takes a great deal of discipline often to say, I really want to focus. I really have to focus on what I'm doing. I'm just wondering if you feel like being undergraduate students in the time of this attention economy where there are these battles going on for our attention, has that affected your relationship to engagement? What would you say, Kai?
Yeah, I would say that has definitely strongly impacted my understanding of engagement and my relationship with it. I really do consider that effort and that discipline that we have to put into ignoring all those outside sources of distraction as being a key part of engagement. And I think for me, it was very hard during the pandemic to pay attention to these online classes and to be completely engaged. Because as you said, if you're on your laptop, even if you put your phone away or turn your notifications off, it just takes like one swipe of the finger and you're looking at something else. And even if you're looking at other homework for other classes, like you're not engaging, even if you're trying to feel productive or trying to get something done. So it's definitely really hard. And I do sympathize with all students and especially young people right now, because it is a crazy time to be on social media of any kind, because it is like a drug, like it's insanely addictive and difficult to resist the temptation to go on it. But I think it's really good that now we're back in person and back in class. And I think school provides you this opportunity with spending time away from your phone and away from all these distractions and all these like instant gratification hits of dopamine that we get off of our phone. And it teaches you to get back to something much more natural, where you're just a person in a classroom with other people listening to your teacher, and you're all there physically and you all want to be there. And it's been a really good feeling for me to get back to that, because it was really strange to go without it. And it definitely impacted my entire idea of learning for a long while.
How about you, Lavínia? What would you say in terms of demands on your attention, and if you feel that that's impacted you in terms of your relationship to engagement and learning?
Absolutely. Before I get into that, I just wanted to highlight something that I should have highlighted before. But I think it's important for us to recognize that, we take for granted our access to remote classes, our ability to connect, our computers or the Wi-Fi's, but that still remains a privilege. So a lot of people around the world during the pandemic, they couldn't continue their education. So I think knowing that and having that idea also helped me be engaged and motivated, because I had this sense of, oh my God, I'm so privileged to be able to do this at this time when, the world is falling apart. And I think I still carry that with me to some extent. But to go back to your question specifically about attention, I did notice that my attention span was a bit, shaky after we came back. Luckily, I am someone who I'm very harsh on myself sometimes. So I will leave my phone and I will not touch it if I want to. But again, that wanting to has also changed. So I did see a change in my attention span. And it was interesting because later on, as it's part of my program, when I went into teaching, real classrooms with teenagers, I realized how that has derailed greatly. I have kids during my placements who cannot focus for more than 30 minutes on a task. And they will tell me so. They will say, Miss, I cannot focus. Can I go for a walk? Or can I do something else? They get really fidgety. They have anger issues. So if our generation struggle with that, I can only imagine what the next generations will face, because that's their norm. Those are the kids who started schooling from the beginning with the remote access and the iPads and everything. So I try to model the behavior. I try to reduce my connections. But again, it's hard when everyone else is demanding you to do differently. So I remember sitting in my online classes and having my mother text me all the time. I'm like, Mom, I'm in class. It doesn't look like it, but I'm in class. And I think a lot of us, myself included, we have internalized that when we're doing something on our computer, we're not actually doing that. We just, make believe. So in a way, I try to go back. I try to avoid my computer, avoid my phone when I'm not doing anything important. But to some extent, we're always doing something important now. It's not back in the day when you just close your door and you're done. No, now you have your emails on your phone. You have social media. Everything's constantly demanding your attention. So finding that balance is a struggle.
I think you're in such a unique position because you're talking to us as a student at McGill, but studying education and being on the teacher side of teaching younger generations, high school students. You're kind of seeing, two sides of the coin here and having to model certain behavior. I'm sure that when you're modeling for your students, you're carrying that into being a student yourself. And it's so true that not only is our attention constantly being grabbed by these technologies and platforms, we are always connected and we're always on, even as in a professional life, it blurs those lines between personal life, academic life, professional life, being just constantly connected to everybody that we know, and having your mom text you, and it's really hard to turn that off and be like, no, I have to be focusing on this now. I can't be engaging with those other elements of my life. So thanks for sharing that.
It's been so interesting to speak to you both and hear your perspectives, where they come together, where they differ a little bit. For me, one of the important reflection questions is, what does it mean to be engaged as a student ultimately mean? I think you've both given great examples of how it affects your learning directly, and how your own goals or sense of personal motivation has this really interesting symbiotic relationship, both with your engagement and with learning itself. So thanks again for being here.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Thanks so much. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Please subscribe to Teach, Learn, Share, and let others know about it. Until next time.